Greetings and welcome to the Aftershow Analysis podcast for UFC 298. As always, I'm your host, Luca Fury. This time, just going solo. In the future, hopefully, I'll be joined by some of my co hosts. Going to be recapping the very good UFC 298 card here. It was a very good card overall in terms of not just some of the fun matchups, but also we had some meaningful results, some interesting things to talk about, some interesting things to look forward to as well. Obviously, we did have a changing of the guard in the main event. Definitely be talking extensively about that. Real quick, do want to, of course, talk about the betting results. It was another winning night. I shouldn't say another winning night because we did actually have a loss last week, but it was a winning night here. We've been doing very well overall. Only have 5 losing cards over the last 6 months now, so it was almost a 10-unit night here. So another good one, but good year overall and everything. Good year long term since the official bets have been added, but still, obviously, a lot of time left here in the year. We never like to rest on our laurels, as we always talk about. So even when we put a big night in the books like this, it's right back to work for next week. So we'll already be getting bets up for the next events and everything. And so obviously, nice event here and everything, but a lot more work to be done as we have a slew of UFC events coming up over the next few months. As for the actual recaps here of the cards, though, do want to talk about, of course, this main event here. Ilia Topuria getting the job done by KO 3 minutes and 32 seconds into round number 1. I thought that Volkanovski, honestly, the entire fight did not look himself. I thought he looked tense. I thought that he looked just sort of out of sorts. I thought he looked not quite there in terms of his reaction time. I thought when you look at, say, his fights versus Max Holloway, where this dude was just next level sharp in terms of the reactions to what his opponent was doing, also the way he was countering everything that Max was doing. Here, he seemed to be in totally a reaction type of mode where it's not like some fighters, they go into like a counter mode where, yes, they're waiting for their opponent to initially react first, and then they're trying to counter that with specific tendencies or specific tactics. That's not what Volkanovski was doing. He just seemed to kind of keep waiting and waiting, and then nothing really happened, and then he would just wait and wait. It didn't really seem like Volk had kind of a plan or any specific tactics. It's not like, again, you look at the Holloway fight where he was baiting Holloway into engaging, getting slightly out of range then when Holloway would move forward, and then stepping back in range to counter him. There was none of that. He would circle sometimes, but then other times he would just back straight into the cage. There wasn't consistency with his footwork. I just thought, honestly, he seemed off. He seemed like a guy who is getting up there in age, who just came off of a knockout loss last time out, took a very short turnaround, had talked about how before that last knockout loss, he was drinking for 4 weeks outside the cage, basically every single day, something he never does. I mean, the writing was on the wall. It's something we talked about on the pre-fight podcast. And it's something to note, not to brag and be like, oh, haha, look how right we were. But a lot of times when people have a guy like a Volkanovski, for example, who is so great, you saw people, the talking points, they even mentioned on the broadcast that people were surprised that this fight was about to pick him in the odds. What disrespect for Volkanovski. Well, the thing is, yes, Volkanovski was a very great fighter. He was one of the GOATs and probably the featherweight GOAT at that. But obviously, the other issues that we just mentioned, the outside the cage stuff, the recent knockouts, that matters. That is a real thing that you have to consider. And it's not just, well, he's so great, that doesn't matter. He'll just bounce back. No, it doesn't matter how great you are. And something we also talked about is the downfalls in MMA, they're usually quite swift. They are usually very, very sudden. Anderson Silva went from the absolute GOAT at the time. Like, if you were not around when Anderson Silva was at his peak, he was the undisputed GOAT. Like, there was no other consideration, really. Maybe some people thought Fedor or GSP, but there wasn't really a good argument. But then, all of a sudden, Anderson Silva just couldn't buy a win. It was ridiculous how he just could not win a fight all of a sudden. And that's how it usually goes for downfalls in MMA. Something, again, we talked about on the podcast. I think after this fight, people will go, wow, in hindsight, this was kind of so obvious. Actually have here in the chat, and please contribute, be answering your guys' questions along the way here tonight. George asked, would you book the rematch? Well, it's interesting. Volkanovski, he seemed to call out, or I shouldn't say seemed to, he did call out Topuria for an immediate rematch in the cage afterwards. And it seems like there's a general consensus among everyone that they don't want that. Like, give him an easier fight. They don't want to see him getting knocked out again. And think of that. Think of how much that has changed. After the first Islam fight, everybody wanted an immediate rematch because it was so close. Then after the next Islam fight, nobody wanted a rematch because obviously he got knocked out. And now he got knocked out again by Topuria. No one even wants to see an immediate rematch for this one, it seems. I'm also, by the way, with them. And it's for good reason. It's because now people are starting to see, wow, Volk is not the same guy he once was. If people were still thinking of him as the same guy, they would want the immediate rematch. That's usually what happens when a long reigning dominant champion loses. People want the immediate rematch. Seems like nobody really out there that I've seen wants that for the most part. And I agree with that. I don't think that Volkanovski should have another short turnaround and another KO loss. Something we talked about going into this fight is he's coming off the first KO loss of his career, and now he's facing one of the very most dangerous one hitter quitter type of opponents of his career. When Islam knocked Volk out, he hit him with a head kick, but then it took a bunch of follow up punches to actually get the stoppage. Here, it was that one big shot, and Volk was donezo. It was basically a one hitter quitter. So I think you're seeing the chin is not the same from Volk anymore. I thought overall, just his reflexes, his general athleticism, strategy, he just did not look like the same guy in the cage to me. So, for one, no, I wouldn't want to see an immediate rematch here. And for two, I think give him a softer opponent, but I don't know if we ever actually see Volk make it back to the title here again. Obviously, featherweight isn't a super deep division, but again, when you look at a guy like Anderson Silva, he was going out there and needed absolute robberies to get past Derek Brunson once his downfall happened. Derek Brunson, who gasses in a round and a half and has one of the worst chins in the UFC. Like prime Anderson Silva would have absolutely clowned that man, and yet he needed a robbery to beat him. So again, when you're looking at Volkanovski, again, you might be going in hindsight. Again, writing was on the wall if he goes out there and loses his next fight as well. So for me, at this point, Volkanovski, I'm not going to be looking to bet him versus anybody. If anything, I'll be looking to fade him. But I definitely think we are seeing the end of Volkanovski's career, at least as a truly elite featherweight. In terms of Topuria, obviously, much different trajectory for him going forward. Really good matchup here from him. Really good showing from him, I should say. Obviously, yes, he got the knockout in the first two rounds, but it's not like he just went out there and it happened coincidentally. I liked the way he was approaching it. I like how he seemed to be kind of looking for the kill shot. He wasn't trying to go out there, lay in big flurries, big combinations, go out there and be flashy or do anything that he doesn't usually do. He basically looked at what his skill set is and what would be the best way to beat a guy like Volkanovski. It's to go out there, try to sniper shot him, wait for your opportunities, wait for the maybe not the golden opportunity, but just give yourself the best percentage at certain times. And don't go out there and make yourself too vulnerable. Obviously, Topuria has had some issues with chin and striking defense and even cardio a bit in the past. So go out there and basically do exactly what he did. Fight at a measured pace, pick your shots well, look for those particular opportunities, but not be too patient with it. And eventually the knockout will probably come. If it did not come at the end of, or I guess middle of round two like it did, I still think that he would have been perfectly fresh in rounds three, at least, maybe even round four, to potentially get the knockout later on. Because again, he wasn't gunning for the finish in an overzealous manner. He wasn't going out there throwing wild flurries or anything particularly flashy. So I think that overall, in terms of what you want to see from an up and coming fighter who is potentially the next great thing in a division, what Topuria has shown in his last two fights was very, very good. It's exactly what you want to see. Against Emmett, he was very cautious against a guy who was one of the better counter kind of power punchers in this division, one of the better one hitter quitter guys himself. And Topuria went out there and he fought with more of a defensive minded approach. That was some of the best defense he's ever shown, but it was at the cost of his offense. That's why I went to a 5 round decision. Here, though, it was different. He wasn't as overzealous as he was, say, against Jai Herbert, but he wasn't as cautious as he was against Emmett. It was a nice balance of the two where he was defensively minded, but also offensively minded in the proper ways as well. So, again, when you're looking at a guy who goes out there and dethrones the all-time great guy in a Volkanovski like this, sometimes it's a fluky thing. Sometimes it's just a stylistic matchup where you go, okay, bad matchup for the champion. But other times it's a guy like Topuria where you go, okay, this guy actually can reign. He has a legitimate, well-rounded skill set. He does have some flaws, but he is noticeably improving them. And obviously, featherweight again, not a super, super strong division. So I think Topuria, I think there's a lot of winnable fights for him here. I don't know if he's going to go on a super dominant reign like a Jose Aldo or a Volkanovski, but I certainly think that he can potentially reign as a champion for a bit here. So as far as this matchup goes, I mean, I think this was pretty much just one of your classic changing of the guard matchups. Volkanovski, he was on the way out, and obviously Topuria very, very clearly on the way up. Not just a younger, fresher fighter at this point, but noticeably getting better each time out. As for the co-main event, Very different fighters there. We had 2 fighters who are both on the way out, and honestly, even after the win, I do still kind of feel like that. We had Robert Whittaker defeating Paulo Costa by unanimous decision. It was 29-28 times 2, and then a 30-27 in there. I thought that was a bit interesting. Now, it's not like it was the craziest score ever to go 10-9 for Whittaker in the first round, but the biggest moment of the fight by far was him almost getting slept at the end. He was visibly wobbled, then took some follow-ups as well. I mean, again, it wasn't like the craziest round one score, but I thought that was a bit interesting that one of the judges did not give Costa that round, despite him having, again, the most dramatic moment of the fight by far, and especially in that round. Ultimately, I did think the decision was right, though. I thought Whittaker won the other 2 rounds. Costa, the thing with him is he's just not a consistent fighter. So again, something we talked about on the pre-fight show. He is inside and outside of the cage, not a consistent guy. He will get away from game plans. Even the chat was mentioning on the pre-fight show. We did a live stream for that. You guys are mentioning how Costa was going out there and taking down Luke Rockhold, who has, an all-time bad chin. Like, why are you grappling with him? An underrated grappler, one of the better grapplers. You choose to grapple with him and not try to knock him out when you're a striker. That's kind of Paulo Costa. So in this fight, he had some success. I thought he looked good in terms of the way he was throwing his individual strikes. I thought they looked a bit sharper and cleaner in terms of his usual technique that he throws. Sometimes he's a bit more of a technical brawler. I thought he was a bit more technical than in the past here, but he seemed to not really understand the pace of the fight and kind of keeping score. He would have a moment where he did well, and then Whittaker would kind of sense that, okay, now, Costa kind of maybe stole the round a bit. Like, say it's, halfway through the round, you can get a sense of who's winning the round so far, right? And maybe Whittaker was doing well, and then Costa would have a big moment, and then it seemed like Whittaker would realize, okay, now maybe the round just shifted to Paulo. And then Whittaker would go and noticeably make an effort to land a flurry or land some sort of volume or pressure him, whereas Costa was not doing the same things. He was not responding in the same way. He was just kind of going out there, doing whatever kind of came to mind, wasn't fighting with sort of an intentional pace or tactic, which is, again, kind of how he's fought generally throughout his entire career. As Greeple here says in the chat, Costa's not had a good show. Costa had a good showing, but he has not looked good since the Yol fight. Yeah, when he fought Izzy, obviously, going up into that point, people thought he was going to be, potentially one of the next big things himself. And then obviously got knocked out by Izzy there. And then it seems like ever since then, he's just kind of gotten caught up with the fame and the extra money in his pocket. And it seems like he's just not all that interested anymore in MMA as his primary focus. Obviously, he did look in good shape going into this fight, but there's a difference between, getting a little bit leaned down in a little bit better shape and actually going out there with a proper game plan and technique and putting all that work in your training camp. And so with Costa, again, it's just he's a guy who's always been inconsistent. He's pulled out of a bunch of fights recently, some fights that honestly would not have even been good from a career choice standpoint anyways. So again, it's just when you're looking at fighters, it's like we talked about with Volkanovski. You want to look at fighters who are consistent. You want to look at fighters who are inconsistent as well, and keep note of that, because a guy like Volkanovski, who was always so consistent before, you knew exactly what you were getting with him. A guy like Costa, who's always been inconsistent, you can kind of never count on what you're getting with him. And so you have to be aware not to either overrate his chances in a fight or underrate them, because maybe it's a fight where he shows out. Maybe it's a fight where he just doesn't show up at all. So this fight was kind of one where you didn't really know what to expect going in. You kind of expected maybe some weird stuff. I thought overall there was that weird stuff from Costa, but I thought that Whittaker actually did look overall pretty solid. My issue with him, and the reason why I still think he's kind of on the way out, the durability. It seemed like every solid strike that hit him, whether it was to the body, the head, a leg kick, seemed like everything that landed clean was hurting him in some type of way. And in the past, when he was at welterweight, he had a bad chin, but then when he went to 185, he had a phenomenal chin. It wasn't until his last kind of handful of fights where he started getting rocked a lot more often, and that's kind of continued. He got obviously stopped by Dricus last fight, and then was rocked a bit here as well. Rocked at the end of the first round, but also, again, some leg kicks, some other shots seemed to sting him a little bit, more so than they would have in the past. And so he is only 33 years old, but man, he is ancient in terms of fight years. So much damage that he sustained over the years. And so, again, can he go out there and beat some of these other middleweights? Sure, of course. He still has the skills, he still has the technique, and I thought he looked overall, in terms of that skill and technique, better here than he had in his last couple of fights. However, again, if you can't take the damage, if you don't have the durability, it's just not going to work out well against the elite guys. And obviously, there are some guys, especially if, say, Alex were to drop back down to 185, Izzy comes back. Some guys can obviously do some real damage to him here in this division. So can Whitaker be a contender? Sure. The division's still, again, relatively weak. I think he's still a contender, but will he be a champion again? Unfortunately, I just don't think so. Speaking of potential future champions, one guy that people have seemed to think is going to be one, at least they used to, anyways. I'm not sure what they think anymore as they now seem to quite hate him. That is Ian Gary defeating Jeff Neal by split decision 30-27, 30-27, both for Gary, and then 29-28 for Jeff Neal. Personally, I thought probably 29-28 Gary was the right score. I thought the fight was closer than what the commentators were making it out to be. I thought it was kind of surprising how they thought they was basically one-way traffic. I thought it was a very close fight. I was even tweeting along the as it was going on that this is one of those fights that people are going to cry robbery either way. Don't be mad at no matter who wins it. And I still, again, I thought that Gary won it, but it was an extremely close fight. He didn't really do a whole lot here, and obviously neither did Neal. However, I do think it's worth noting, and again, I know Gary's very hated. People don't want to compliment him or anything like that, but you got to be analytical. You got to be objective here when you're analyzing these fights if you want to actually win at betting. And I have noticed that Gary has made some noticeable improvements over his last few fights, particularly his awareness in the pocket and his overall head movement and defense. It's still not elite. It's still not that great, even, but it's definitely getting to the point of being great. There were some moments here where Jeff Neal threw some great strikes in the pocket, some really good, clean, crisp combinations, and Gary absolutely saw every single thing he was doing and absolutely effortlessly dodged everything. Those were the same types of situations in the past where he's either gotten rocked or clipped. So again, there is a noticeable improvement within the game of Gary. I know a lot of people don't want to see it because they don't like it, don't like him so much, but it's something you just got to be aware of. Again, you have to be objective with these fighters. Jeff Neal on the flip side, again, talked about pre-fight. He's another guy who was inconsistent. You don't really know what you're getting with him. I thought this is one of the bad nights from him. He never really seemed to kind of put his foot on the gas here, as we talked about. And I think it was kind of, the thought of everyone going into this one. If Jeff Neal was to win, he had to make it a firefight. He could not have this happen where he just let Gary go out there, methodically pot shot him, dictate the range, dictate the pace, dictate the tempo. If you allow that to happen against Gary, he's going to do what he did. He's going to make it kind of a slow, not necessarily the most exciting fight, and it's going to go to a kind of plodding decision. Sometimes he still happens to get a finish in that case, but a lot of times it does kind of slow down the fight. And Neal, he just never really made it that firefight. He seemed to be perfectly fine, just kind of fighting at that slow, kind of measured pace, kind of trading shot for shot, and both just going out there and pot shotting each other, and just did not work for him. And again, this has been kind of the case of Jeff Neal in a lot of fights. They're very winnable in terms of his skills and his techniques, but his game plan, his strategy, his consistency, it is just not there. And this is, again, the tale of this man's career. You can go back to not just his last loss, but his loss before that and before that. This is how he usually loses fights. You look at the fight afterwards and go, man, if he would have just done a couple little things just slightly different, he probably walks away with a win, but he just never makes those adjustments. I think part of it is his corner. They're just saying things like, you're not tired. Don't believe that you're tired. You're not tired. Like, come on, dude. What is that doing? Like, you're just trying to convince the dude that he can't feel his arms feeling all slow with the lactic acid. Like, what are you doing here? Like, give the man actual technical advice, strategic advice. Point out what he's doing wrong. Point out what he needs to do so he can actually change the dynamic of the fight. Don't just go, you're not tired. It's like when the corners are like, clearly their fighters losing the fight down 2-0, and they're like, you're doing great, beautiful stuff, let's just go out there and keep doing what you're doing. It's like, no, you're down 2-0, you got to do something different. Cornering is, I don't know what it is with MMA, but bad cornering is an epidemic. It has always been an issue, decade after decade. It has improved in some ways, like at the higher levels, the cornering is definitely better than it was in the past, but you still have some absolutely garbage cornering out there at all levels of the UFC and MMA. So Jeff Neal, I think he's a skilled fighter, a very good fighter, but I do think he's a self-sabotager. I do not think that this dude fights up to his potential. I think he consistently goes out there and shows that he can actually be winning the fights that he is losing, and that is just so unfortunate to see. In the case of Gary, again, he's going out there and showing improvements himself. He called out Colby Covington, who is on the complete opposite trajectory. He's obviously on a skid now and is probably on the way out himself. Hasn't won a fight in quite some time now. I think that fight would actually be a very good one from a logical standpoint. Obviously, Colby's much more experienced and has fought at a higher level. But if Gary were to go out there and beat him, that's obviously a good name, good win on his resume. And obviously, if Colby were to win, maybe it puts him back in, the category for not necessarily a title shot, but maybe, puts him on track to earn some sort of contender fight down the line. I think no matter who won that fight, it would actually be beneficial for both guys. And also, considering both are so hated, maybe whoever wins that fight would actually gain some new fans by beating one of the other hated guys in MMA. So, kind of like an enemy of my enemy is a friend type of scenario. So, in terms of Gary, again, I know a lot of people hate him, but you do have to note he is making noticeable improvements. Do I think he will be a future champion? I've always been on record saying that I don't believe that, and I think he's overrated in that sense. But I still stand by that. But I will say to see him improve in the very specific ways that he has and develop some real defensive technique. Again, still make some mistakes out there, still has some lapses, but to see the specific improvement from him, it does actually give me some better hope for him that he may actually become more of a legitimate contender. Again, I still don't think he's going to be an actual champion, but maybe becomes closer to one, maybe more of a legit challenger at some point down the line. Speaking of future title challengers, we had Merab Dvalishvili taking on Henry Cejudo, the former champion. Merab winning by unanimous decision, 29-28 times 3. Again, agreed with the judges here. Thought they got this one right. Also had it 29-28 for Merab on my scorecard. Ultimately, it came down to, again, as we said on the pre-fight podcast, the aggression of Merab. In terms of the skills, in terms of the technique, as you saw, they were almost even in every area. Cejudo had his moments in the striking. He actually was able to rock Merab in the first round, but then Merab actually had his moments as well, where he was able to land some big shots on Cejudo. You also saw in the wrestling, both had their moments. You saw in the clinch, both had their moments. It was a very even fight. However, what was a difference here, what was basically always the difference in Merab's wins, is this dude has just an incredible pace. You're talking about Henry Cejudo, who just went 5 rounds with Sterling and looked fine down the stretch, who's a former Olympian, obviously, a gold medalist. The guy's had tremendous cardio himself throughout his career. There was points earlier in MMA where he actually showed a little bit of cardio issues, but in his peak, he actually had very good cardio. And he goes out here, and the pace of Merab broke him. People talk about Merab weaponizing pace and cardio. It is such a true term. He weaponizes it. That is how he wins his fights. Again, you saw throughout all 3 rounds, in terms of the true skill, they were basically even in all areas. They do a bit of different techniques in the different areas, whether it's striking or wrestling. But in terms of how good they are, they were basically even. But it was the pace and the cardio of Merab that was the difference and won him the fight. I mean, talk about at this division, the lower weight classes, you usually don't have that because everyone has pretty good cardio for the most part. To see Henry Cejudo noticeably exhausted after like a round and a half, 2 rounds here, he got a second wind at one point, but he looked like dead at one point midway through the fight. It just goes to show you the incredible pace that Merab has. There's a reason why they've kept him far away from Sean O'Malley. Obviously, he can't do that anymore. He's going to have to, fight the contenders eventually. Seems like they basically announced that Merab would be next in line. Joe Rogan did, at least in the post fight there. So I think that is the fight we'll get next, assuming O'Malley defeats Chito Vera, which is already a tough fight for Sean there. The thing is about Merab, though, like, obviously, I know people are going to look at that fight and go, yeah, obviously the takedowns, the wrestling, the cardio, the weaponized pace that I just mentioned, that's obviously going to be a problem for Sean. Don't get me wrong. He does not have the wrestling that Merab does. I doubt he can handle that pace of a guy's, like Cejudo and other ones, guys like Jan couldn't do it. I don't think that O'Malley will be able to. Um, but the thing with Merab is his striking defense, man. It is still such an issue. We've seen it obviously in other fights like Marlon Moraes. We've seen him get tagged, but not necessarily rocked so bad like he did there. But he got rocked here again by Cejudo, and he was getting tagged with some other shots along the way. The way he charges in, he doesn't really tuck his chin. He kind of keeps his hands down. He depends on his chin and his durability too much. Like, obviously, again, I don't want to discount that, yes, his wrestling and his cardio absolutely will be a problem for O'Malley. But I also would not honestly be remotely surprised if O'Malley just absolutely lamps this dude on the way in, like he did to his teammate Aljamain Sterling. The way that Sterling just charged in, hands down, chin up in the air, like I posted the screenshot of it on Twitter before, being like, this should not exist in a UFC championship fight, charging in like this ever from either the champion or the contender. That was just so Bush League. And yet Merab does the exact same thing. The exact same thing. Now, yes, he is a more threatening, more dynamic wrestler than Sterling is. He's also more durable and tough and resilient, both physically and mentally, but the fact that it is there, obviously, O'Malley and his camp are gonna be able to see that on the tape, and they're definitely going to be targeting it, and so, in that matchup, again, assuming if O'Malley was able to make it past, Chito Vera, I would probably favor Merab, but I would also not be very confident in him based on that just atrocious striking defense when he makes his entries. So I still think he's absolutely deserving of being the next contender. I think he might actually be able to win the belt. He will probably be my pick in that fight, regardless of who wins between Cheeto and O'Malley. But there is definitely the potential for either Cheeto or O'Malley to knock him out on one of his entries, whether it's with a striking entry or a takedown entry. As for the opening fight of the main card, we had Anthony Fluffy Hernandez defeating Roman Kopylov by rear naked choke midway through the second round, 3 minutes and 23 seconds. To be honest, I was actually sort of half watching this fight. I was kind of doing some stuff in the background, getting it done before the rest of the main card went on. I saw more so the second round than the first. Obviously, Kopylov, he was doing a good job in the first round defending the takedowns. Actually seemed like potentially we had an upset on our hands. Obviously, striker versus grappler here. Hernandez being the grappler, Kopylov being the striker. But man, the takedown defense was not consistent at all, to say the least. Round two came along. He got taken down. And Hernandez, he went for the rear naked choke. He kind of had it on the chin, and it didn't look like it was quite close. But Kopylov wasn't doing a lot of the right things to defend. He kind of was just sort of waiting for Hernandez to let go of it. And then that kind of happened a couple of times where you got the feeling like, okay, one of these times he's just going to get it eventually. And then he did. And then there was no resistance. And then it was a quick tap out. So it was one of those cases where Kopylov, lesser, sort of a green guy, lesser experienced on the mat, obviously, had shown some issues in the past on the ground. Obviously, as we talked about going into this fight, this was kind of a measuring stick performance for him. How much has his takedown defense improved? How much has the grappling defense improved? Well, we got our answer. Pretty much not at all. The takedown defense looked good for a round, but I'm sorry. If you can only keep it up for a round, I'm not really ready to say that's improved. Like, you got to be able to keep it up at least for two here. I mean, come on. One round, that's not trying to be harsh here, but that's kind of pathetic. Like, he obviously had the skill. He improved his skill, but I guess it just sapped his energy. I don't know what he's doing in the gym in terms of his training that he's not able to do defensive grappling for more than one round. That's just kind of unacceptable at the UFC level. So he's a guy who obviously does have some threatening strikes. He does have power, a finishing ability, but you cannot be in the UFC and be such a one-dimensional fighter. You have to have a more well-rounded game. You have to have more to bring to the table. You have to have another gear to be able to shift into if your first is not working out. And you see time and time again with these guys like a Kopylov, they have some potential, they have a skill set, they have a dynamic aspect to their game, but it's the only thing they have for them. And they sort of start to add on to it. Maybe they had some takedown defense, but they never kind of grasp the concept that in order to actually be truly successful at the UFC level in 2024 and beyond, you have to be a legitimately well-rounded fighter. You can't just be a specialist who's good at one thing and only sort of decent at other things. If you want to be a specialist, you have to have real legit defense in the other areas, and clearly he just does not have that. So that will do it for this recap of the main card here. I've actually not seen the prelims. I actually had to take a nap. I had such a busy week. I worked a lot and researching the card and everything. I did not get much sleep. I think I had to get like a sleep debt catch up. So I was super tired in the afternoon. I took a nap. So I will catch the replay of these fights tomorrow. Seems good from what I heard, and also looking at the results, seems like there's some interesting results in terms of who won, but also some fun matchups. So I'll definitely be watching those over the next couple of days. But that will do it as far as my thoughts on the matchup, since I didn't actually get to see the other fights yet. Do want to just once again recap the betting results for the night. Overall, it was a plus 8.97 unit night for the official bets, all third-party tracked and verified. Balboa, the new handicapper that we added a couple of weeks ago, he won 9.79 units on the UFC event, 2.33 units on the KSW event, and then lost 1.2 units on Octagon 55. As for Liam, he lost minus 1.95 units on the UFC. So again, all combined and together between the multiple handicappers and events, it was a plus 8.97 unit week. So very good stuff there. We already have bets up for the next event. And again, now that we have added the addition of Balboa, we won't just be betting UFC events, we'll be betting the non-UFC events every single week. So whether there's a UFC event and that means multiple betting events, or if it's an off week from the UFC, that means there'll still be other events that we will have official bets on. There's going to be no more weeks off for the Patreon. So hopefully you guys have been tailing and profiting. Hopefully you'll be tailing us for the next event as well. Again, bets already up now on Patreon and Dub Club. So hopefully you enjoyed this episode of the podcast. It was a great event. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that as well and made some money on it. Until next time, I'm Luca Fury, and thank you for listening.